But now we would have to look at some of these problems in a slightly more detailed fashion in order to understand what is it exactly that these, how is it exactly that these problems arise, and what would be their consequences on human beings. So before we do that, it would be instructive for us to understand a little bit of science. We have to look at this environmental aspects from the natural environment itself, and how the natural environment itself has been affected by man's activities. And man's activities, as I say, are economic in nature. So therefore, there's a connection between economics, man's activities, and the natural environment. Some of the important aspects of the environment are the natural biogeochemical cycles that exist in the world of their own in a state of nature when no man's activity ever was of any significance. These are called the natural cycles. And what we are going to do is look at the natural cycle itself, understand it in a fashion in which it would have existed had there been no human intervention or activities, and then go on to see how human interaction and human intervention on the environment has affected these cycles, and then go on to connect them to the consequences of that effect that human activity has on, ironically, back on human beings. And therefore, that's the objective of looking at these natural cycles in this. Now, a natural cycle, what do we mean by a cycle? And therefore, we would like to understand the meaning of a cycle. A cycle, of course, is a change which comes back to its original state and which repeats itself. So therefore, there can be various cycles in nature, there can be various cycles. Even they say that sometimes history repeats itself, there's a cycle. Fashions go through cycles, and sometimes it's possible that certain old fashions that existed long back now again become a part of the fashion. So therefore, you can see that there are various kinds of ways in which we look at cycles, but we will be looking at particularly natural cycles. In particular, we will be looking at the biogeochemical cycles in nature. And in how do we define these? These would be defined as a pathway by which a chemical substance moves through its biotic and abiotic environments. Now, what do we mean by these both biotic and abiotic environments? Well, the biosphere is the biotic part of the environment, which is all about the living organisms that exist within the environment. So the plants, fauna, bacteria, soil bacteria, and all these living beings are all part of the biotic environment. Whereas the abiotic is the non-living aspects of the environment. You're looking at the atmosphere, you're looking at rocks, you're looking at water bodies, you're looking at all these. This is the abiotic part of the environment, and therefore what we're doing is we're looking at particular chemical substances which are very important to human activity and for human sustenance of life itself. And some of these basic chemicals, how do they move through the biotic and the abiotic environments, and what kind of a cycle do these have? And more importantly, has man's activity affected these cycles? In what way? And what is the consequence of those effects? That is the reason that we study natural cycles in themselves. There are many natural cycles that life science has enumerated, but for my purpose, I am only confining myself to 4 important natural cycles. One is the water cycle, which is also called the hydrological cycle, and then the carbon cycle, because carbon is a fundamental element for living organisms, and we are all carbon based, and the nitrogen cycle and the sulfur cycle. These are the 4 cycles that I will be looking at in order to understand the man's activities, how they have affected these. Now, obviously, each of these cycles has been in some way or the other affected, modified, and changed by economic activity of man. And it's that impact on these natural cycles that has economic consequences. And it is the function of these, it's the function of an environmental economist to be able to understand these economic impacts. The reason that we need to know a bit of science in this is because otherwise we can't appreciate where these problems are coming from and how these problems arise in the first place. So as an environmental economist, we are also important scientists in some sense, that we should have a much holistic understanding of this. Now, what we are going to do is look at cycles as they existed in their natural state of nature, and as they existed when man's activity was not a very significant one. Let's look at the water cycle first. Now here's a wonderful diagram of the water cycle that we have, and you can see that there are lots of elements that are there in this water cycle. I'm going to start by systematically zeroing in on each of some of the important elements. If you notice that is something called evaporation, and you find evaporation in two places in this diagram. One is from the water storages in oceans and other places, and you may find evaporation also occurring from streams and springs and freshwater storage. And added to this kind of evaporation is evapotranspiration. And evapotranspiration I will explain in a minute, which comes from plants and other kinds of foliage and fauna. Now let's look at evaporation itself. What is evaporation? I think we all know from school what is evaporation. It's the sun heats up the liquid, the water rises, it changes into a gaseous state, and it rises up into, and this is known as the process of evaporation. What does evaporation do? Well, evaporation actually rises into the atmosphere and forms clouds. And this is the water that evaporates from the earth's oceans, lakes, and moist soil, and it goes into the atmosphere. Now there's another process of evaporation called evapotranspiration, which happens from the plants. It's like as if the plants are sweating the way human beings sweat, and this is called transpiration, and this occurs from the plants where water evaporates from the surfaces of their leaves. This water, which is absorbed by the roots from the groundwater which is required for the plant, travels through the plant, and some of this water evaporates from the leaf surfaces. So you would imagine that a rainforest, which is densely populated by plants and trees, the transpiration would be significantly large because there is a lot of transpiration that happens that goes into the atmosphere. Now, that is about evaporation and transpiration. Now there's another thing that happens. Once evaporation happens, we are looking at condensation. What is condensation? Well, as you know, that when water rises into the atmosphere, higher you go up, the cooler it gets, and when it cools down, water changes back into its liquid state, and that process of change is known as condensation. And when there's a large enough amount of water vapor in the air which begins to condense, then it forms beautiful clouds like this. And some of these clouds then become rain clouds, and we'll be coming to that in a minute. So that's the idea. So evaporation and evapotranspiration sends water vapor into the atmosphere. It condenses, it becomes clouds, and what happens then? Once that is done, then you have the third important aspect of the water cycle, which is called precipitation. Precipitation is the discharge of water in the form of rain, then which falls back into the oceans, lakes, and rivers, and on land. So the evaporated water then condenses and then precipitates back onto the earth, and this rain that falls, it falls all over the globe. It can fall into oceans, it can fall onto river bodies, it can fall onto water bodies, and it can fall on land, correct? So when it falls on land, then there are two or three things that happen when water gets absorbed by the land. One of the consequences of water getting absorbed by the soil and the land is that it forms what is known as a groundwater table. And this groundwater table is basically consisting of the clouds which through rain deposit water on the land, which infiltrates into the permeable soil, and then this soil then stores this moisture in some sense, and some of these ways in which it stores are through what are called permeable rocks or soil. And these permeable means that which is porous, which can in which water and water moisture can permeate into these, and it gets stored in form of these rocks in soil. And let me also tell you that these can also form aquifers of water inside the ground, and some of these aquifers are can be recharged by other sources of water within the ground. Sometimes they are not rechargeable, in which case the groundwater that gets stored in this fashion is in a fixed quantity. Now, why would an economist be interested in this? It makes a lot of difference when he is analyzing the process of depletion of water from the groundwater table. It depends on whether this water can be replenished easily by rains or by rechargeable aquifers within the ground, or it is fixed in quantity. That changes the economics of depletion of any of these of water in particular here. And through capillary action, some of this water again rises back onto the soil, and then the process of evaporation again takes place, and the cycle is completed. So therefore, you have first the water storage in oceans, then through the process of evaporation, it condenses into the atmosphere, and then it precipitates, and when it precipitates, it melts, it goes off into streams and rivers, and on land, a part of the land water on land gets locked in groundwater storage, and a part of it is then discharged back into the oceans, and the cycle of water is then completed. So that is the simple water cycle that you have in a state of nature where no economic activity has really impinged on this. Now, how is the water cycle broken by man's activity? Well, there is a very obvious way in which man's activity has affected the water cycle and has also created certain problems for man himself. For example, the burning of fossil fuels by the activities of the industrial activities and other activities of man results in large amounts of sulfur and nitrogen, nitrous oxides being released into the atmosphere, which then mix with the water vapor and can form dilute forms of nitric acid as well as sulfuric acid, and that may rain back onto the land as acid rain, and therefore SO2 and NOx, the oxides of nitrogen, are then carried by the wind onto the clouds. It mixes with water vapor, and acid rain is the result of this. So that's one effect. And what is the effect of acid rain? Well, it affects human beings in various ways. Here's a photograph of a man whose skin has been affected by acid rain, and it also affects buildings and monuments that we build and construct. For example, especially if monuments are constructed out of natural materials like granite or marble or such things. In India, it was said that the Taj Mahal was being affected by the industrial pollution, which then mixed with water vapor and deposited on the marble of Taj Mahal, discoloring the marble of Taj Mahal, and there was a great move to restore the pristine whiteness of Taj. But here is an example of how a monument can be completely defaced by acid and acid rain. Now, acid rain does not have to be in the form of always rain pelting down with a lot of acid in it, but it can happen over a long period of time through the minute actions of this very dilute acids in the water vapor of the place itself, and can over time completely deface a statue like this. It can have effects on animals as well, and sometimes acid rain can kill fish. It can kill lots of other kinds of animals too. Although I'm not a scientist, I'm not a biologist, but we know that these effects are important for us as economists, because if acid rain affects health, or acid rain affects the uptake and maintenance of buildings, makes it more costlier for us to maintain buildings, then we are indirectly paying a price for our own activities that we have. And this price is usually not taken into account in the costs of production of things. So therefore, it's important that we recognize that there are indirect consequences, and these eventually have economic costs, and that's the reason we are looking at these. The second part of the whole effects on water cycle is the effect of greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are those gases which actually result from the burning of fossil fuels, and this results in the release of these greenhouse gases. Can be carbon dioxide, for example. And carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. What is a greenhouse gas? The greenhouse effect is basically keeping the warmth of the earth within itself, like a greenhouse traps the warmth in a greenhouse for plants to grow. Similarly, the earth gets warmed unnaturally with the presence of large amounts of greenhouse gases in its atmosphere. And what does this is that it results in global warming. And you know, global warming has disastrous consequences, maybe a long run, but still has consequences, because if the earth gets warmer and warmer, then you can see that the changes in the hydrological cycle intensify, evaporation and other things intensify, which can create large amounts of precipitation in very in untimely situations, which can destroy agricultural crops. It can result in flooding in some parts. It can result in drought in another part, where all the moisture is being removed and it travels in different places. So there can be consequences on agricultural production. There can be consequences on human activity, and it also changes the climate, and it can also change the oceanic levels themselves. So you may find that certain small countries and islands are in the danger of getting inundated by the rising levels of water. So therefore, these are some of the other effects of greenhouse gases on the water cycle. So this is in brief and the idea of the water cycle itself and the effects of man's activities on the water cycle. The next cycle that we will be very much interested in is the carbon cycle. Why are we so interested in the carbon cycle? What is carbon? Carbon is an element which consists of 6 protons and 6 neutrons. But the important part of the reason why we want to study the carbon cycle is because carbon is the basis of all life on Earth. And all life on Earth is carbon based, and it's found in all Earth systems. But carbon as an element is exchanged extremely slowly in the environment, and therefore you have carbon cycles which are very long in duration, and you have carbon cycles which may be shorter in duration. The very, very long carbon cycles in which rocks and others give up slowly carbon atoms, and then the carbon cycle releases the carbon back into the atmosphere, is so long that it really does not merit us to be analyzing that, because the consequences and effects of those are really not very well known as of now, and perhaps may not be as significant as the medium and long-term cycles that we are going to look at. Now, I look at one of the important aspects of carbon cycle is what is the concept of carbon transfer. Carbon transfer means between, as we said, a cycle is the movement of a chemical through the biotic and the abiotic environments is what is the process through which it goes and returns back to its original state, and the process repeats itself is what we call a geobiochemical cycle. And the carbon transfer is what we analyze, which happens to the carbon element when it transfers from the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and the biosphere. Obviously, the biosphere part of it is the biotic component of the ecosystem, whereas the geosphere and atmosphere and hydrosphere are the abiotic components of the ecosystem. Now, photosynthesis is a very interesting phenomena that occurs in plants and has a very important role to play in transfer of carbon through the biosphere. Similarly, and photosynthesis perhaps has to be coupled with what we called respiration, what we are calling respiration here, but basically this is also part of the evaporating or transpiration that we talked about in the water cycle. So evapotranspiration, respiration are almost the same thing that we are going to talk about from different points of view. Now, consumption of carbon and decomposition and combustion. These are three other elements in which facilitate the carbon transfer. So carbon transfer between the abiotic and biotic components is through photosynthesis, respiration, consumption, decomposition, and combustion, right? Now we'll look at some of these things in a little more detail. The larger aspect of the release of carbon when rocks break down is called weathering, but that contributes not to the medium and long run term cycles of carbon, but it contributes to the very, very long run of carbon cycle, which we are not really looking at today. There is also, when evaporation takes place, some of the carbon which is dissolved vaporizes, and this also creates a cycle between the ocean and the atmosphere. Now, the basic photosynthesis is based upon the fact that the energy from the sun is used by the plant, and the plant takes in carbon dioxide and water it uses, and then it gives out oxygen during the day, and it converts the carbon dioxide and water and other things for its own use within the system, within the plant system. Now, the point is that consumption and respiration is the other side of this, which is the release of carbon dioxide. So photosynthesis absorbs carbon dioxide during the day, and the consumption and respiration together gives out the carbon dioxide during the night, and therefore respiration takes place all the time, but then the carbon dioxide in the night is released by the plant in the night, and that is called the respiration of the plant, and photosynthesis is where carbon dioxide is taken in from the atmosphere, it's released back to the atmosphere through consumption and respiration. Similarly, you have animals and men and human beings and other living organisms which breathe in and breathe out. We breathe in air and we take in the oxygen, and we essentially breathe out carbon dioxide. And in this diagram you also have another element that has crept into the picture. On the extreme right hand side you see an oil well which is also spurting out certain kinds of fossil fuels that have been recently taken out of the ground, but there also there's a large amount of carbon dioxide that can be released into the atmosphere. Now, decomposition and combustion is another way in which carbon transfer takes place, because when animals die or plants die, they decay, and when they decay and decompose, carbon atoms are then returned to the atmosphere. Some of these are not completely decomposed and end up in the geosphere within the ground as deposits like oil, coal, and other things. So these are the fossil fuels that we talk about, or they may be deposited at the bottom of the ocean, and usually they say that the carbon reservoir is in the bottom of the ocean, and the ocean has the largest amount of carbon deposits known to man. There is also the natural combustion that takes place. It could happen through forest fires that happen naturally, or even more dramatic, it could happen through a volcanic eruption that you can see. That happened in Chile. Very, very large, tons and tons and tons of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide are released into the atmosphere when such events occur. And these are also part of the natural carbon cycle systems. Now, obviously, the man's activity in impinging upon the carbon cycle is again the burning of fossil fuels. Most of the time, when we are burning fossil fuels, we release sulfur dioxide, we also release certain nitrogen, oxides of nitrogen, and of course, one of the main ingredients that we release is carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide or carbon emissions, as we now know them, are one of the main reasons why a large amount of carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere over and above the natural carbon cycle processes, and this is due to man's activity, industrial pollution, and you can see the amount of carbon dioxide that's released in traffic, in the traffic, such as what you see, is really very large. Of course, California and other places are known for their smog because of the release of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. You also have carbon emissions released into the atmosphere through other means, such as millions and millions of rural households which release this carbon through improper combustion in their cooking processes and other things. And you may also have the burning of garbage or incinerating garbage and waste systems in urban centers can also release and contribute to a large amount of carbon dioxide in the air. And all of us know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So the problem with having excess amounts of carbon emissions is that there are very large possibilities of having greenhouse effects, global warming and other things. Oceans store large amounts of carbon, and the largest exchange of carbon in the carbon cycle is between the ocean surface and the atmosphere. As I said, the ocean is the largest reservoir of carbon in the world, and there's a large amount of carbon dioxide that is exchanged between the ocean and the ocean surfaces. Now, in a gist, I have the carbon cycle in this diagram along with man's activities in terms of auto and factory emissions, where we are showing the dead organisms and waste products which either result in fossil fuels or fossils or get back into the atmosphere. The roots through respiration and plants through respiration also release carbon dioxide in the night into the atmosphere, and organic carbon in the atmosphere is of course absorbed and then released by the plants, and that is through the process of photosynthesis. So this is, in short, it's not just animal respiration, it's all human and other people's respiration that would contribute to the carbon cycle. So obviously the effect that man's activity on carbon on the carbon cycle is to release excessive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. And one of the reasons why we are so worried about carbon emissions is that this excess amount of carbon into the atmosphere can create climatic changes and oceanic levels can rise. So everything is interconnected. It interferes with the carbon cycle, excess of carbon into the atmosphere, and then the hydrological cycle gets affected too. There's too much of precipitation, there's too much of global warming. So they're all interconnected, but these are some of the isolated effects that we can talk about in terms of the carbon and water cycles. In part 2, we look at two other cycles which have a very important effect, which is the sulfur and nitrogen cycles. The last two cycles that we will be looking at are the sulfur and nitrogen cycles. The important thing to understand is that these cycles don't operate in isolation, but when combined with the other cycles of nature, create different kinds of conditions for human beings. And the results of human activity impinge on these cycles, which then interact with the other cycles that exist in nature, and together the consequences are borne by human beings on this. For example, the sulfur cycle, one of the most important parts for us, for our understanding of the sulfur cycle from an economic point of view, is the fact that decomposition through either natural causes like a volcanic eruption or decomposition of organic matter releases large amounts of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, or it releases hydrogen sulfide as a gas into the atmosphere. And added to this are the emissions from human activities that also release hydrogen sulfide into the atmosphere or release large amounts of SO2, as you would see in a minute. Now the point is that when you have large amounts of coal and oil and sulfur containing sulfur to burning to produce electricity for our needs, then sulfur dioxide is a result that is released into the atmosphere. Another way in which sulfur dioxide is released into the atmosphere is when we do refining of petroleum products through refineries. The refineries which contain the petroleum which contains sulfur, when it's being refined or purified, means that it's releasing sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. There are other ways in which sulfur dioxide is released, and that is when we convert sulfuric metals into free metals, and that also releases large amounts of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, sulfur dioxide reacts with the water in the atmosphere, and through the hydrological cycle forms the precipitation of acid rain. And as we know, we have seen in the water cycle that this can create problems for infrastructure. It can create problems for marble or stone based monuments, which makes the upkeep of these things much more expensive. And when it is mixed with smoke and suspended particulate matter, it can cause heart disease and asthma. Now these are some of the effects of the sulfur cycle that are again a result of the burning of fossil fuels. So it seems to us very clear that the burning of fossil fuel by itself has ramifications on all the natural cycles, and one remains to see whether human activity has any kind of a effect on the nitrogen cycle that we would be looking at. In fact, it's the nitrogen cycle which adds another degree of complexity to the environmental problems, which is in terms of the depletion of the ozone layer. But that is a result of not so much as burning of fossil fuels, though they do release nitrogen oxides of nitrogen into the atmosphere, but it is also the result of the use of chemical fertilizers, as we will see. The nitrogen cycle is a process by which we convert nitrogen into its various chemical forms, and again it involves certain processes that we can write down. Both of them, these processes are both biotic and abiotic, so biological and physical processes are involved in this conversion. And the important concepts in understanding this conversion are three, and one is fixation, nitrification, and denitrification. So these are the three main processes that I have isolated for the purposes of this lecture for us to understand how the nitrogen is converted between its various chemical forms. Why is nitrogen so important? It is necessary for all known forms of life on Earth. It forms one of the bases for our DNA and RNA, because it makes up for the nucleic, it's present in the nucleic acid, and therefore nitrogen, and also nitrogen gas, is a large constituent of the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, atmospheric nitrogen is the largest component of the gas in the Earth. One of the important aspects of nitrogen is that it's an inert gas, in the sense that it does not react with other, so therefore it's a really relatively non-reactive gas, which cannot be used per se by plants as it is, as oxygen can be used by plants but not nitrogen in its gaseous state cannot be used. What it has to be then done is that a chemical process, or what we call fixation, is necessary to convert this gas or this nitrogen, this gaseous nitrogen, into compounds of nitrates or ammonia, which then can be used by plants. And therefore there is this process of natural fixation that happens in the nitrogen cycle. What is this fixation? It is usually done by bacteria, and it's done by free living or symbiotic bacteria that convert this inert nitrogen gas into a form of nitrate which can then be usable by plants and others. They make it possible to convert other forms of nitrogen into what are called organic compounds. And these organic compounds then therefore enable the plant to use nitrogen in its living system. Now, where do these bacteria live? They basically live in the roots and nodules of legumes such as peas, alfalfa, and other kinds of trees. And therefore, if you are growing too many of legumes in peas and alfalfa, you will see that you are actually changing the system of fixation of nitrogen by bacteria in the ecosystem. Legumes will often increase the nitrogen content of nitrogen poor soils, but there are other aspects of this that are very important. The conversion of ammonia to nitrate is called nitrification. Now, we finished fixation, we come to nitrification, and so the conversion of ammonia to nitrates is called nitrification. And now this is also performed by nitrifying bacteria which are living in the soil. And it's important for ammonia to be converted into nitrates or nitrites, because ammonia gas as such is toxic to plants. And so therefore, the conversion of ammonia into nitrate is a very important process if plants have to use nitrogen for their survival. Okay. Now, the point is that some of these nitrates can also enter groundwater. And if they do enter the groundwater, then elevated nitrates in groundwater is a concern for drinking purposes. It's not a very healthy thing to have, and it can interfere with the blood oxygen and can result in what is known as the blue baby syndrome. And so if you have too much of nitrates in the soil, then this can create a problem when the soil, when the water, when you irrigate and there are nitrates in the soil, they sink into the groundwater. If the groundwater table is high, then it's used by human communities and living people, and then these problems can crop up. Now, the point is that we would like to also look at the other aspect of nitrification, which is called denitrification. It is the reduction of nitrates back into inert nitrogen gas, which completes the nitrogen cycle. So therefore, fixation, nitrification, denitrification, this completes the nitrogen cycle. But in the process of that, how does denitrification ever happen? It happens under not aerobic conditions, but under anaerobic conditions. Anaerobic conditions is the lack of oxygen. In conditions where waterlogged soils, where there is no air to aid the process, it occurs in such conditions. So these are called anaerobic bacteria. Anaerobic bacteria don't need air to survive. And these denitrifying bacteria use these nitrates in the soil to carry out the respiration, and consequently they produce nitrogen gas, which is then inert and again unavailable to plants. And through the process of fixation, it converts back into nitrates, and the plants use it, and the whole process starts all over again. Now that's in essence but the human factor. Now let's look at what does the human factor have to do with the nitrogen cycle? Well, excessive cultivation or the use of the Haber-Bosch process, which is the process of creating ammonia in order to create chemical fertilizers, can release large amounts of oxides of nitrogen. And the pollution emitted by vehicles and industrial plants can also release a large amount of nitrogen. For example, in New Delhi, there was a Supreme Court order which said that all vehicular traffic of the RTC buses should be now converted into CNG. So when we converted to CNG, we got rid of certain problems of suspended particulate matter due to incomplete combustion of petrol-driven engines came down drastically, so that the atmosphere looked cleaner in New Delhi after the Supreme Court orders. But CNG releases larger amounts of nitrogen oxides into the atmosphere, which have their own consequences. So you give one and you take another. But I just give this example that if you're trying to control one group of suspended particulate matters and SO2s into the atmosphere, you may be doing it at the cost of releasing something else into the atmosphere. In fact, human beings have more than doubled the annual transfer of nitrogen into biologically available forms, and some of these overuse of chemical fertilizers and overuse of some of these processes in the production of chemical fertilizers has created large amounts of nitrogen into biologically available forms, and this has significantly contributed to the transfer of nitrogen trace gases from the earth to atmosphere and from the land to aquatic systems. Now there are fallouts of this. The human interaction or alterations to the global nitrogen cycle are most intense wherever industrial agriculture is the highest. Industrial agriculture, by which I mean the use of large scale fertilizers and other kinds of things. The nitrogen dioxide, that is, or the nitrogen oxides that are released into the atmosphere, can also result from agricultural fertilization we have talked about, biomass burning, cattle and feedlots, and industrial sources. Now the important problem with this is that it breaks down and acts as a catalyst in the destruction of atmospheric ozone. So here is one of the greenhouse gases which contributes not just to global warming and other things, but it also contributes to the depletion of ozone in the atmosphere. It is currently the third largest contributor to global warming after carbon dioxide and methane. Ammonia, which is in its form in the atmosphere, has tripled as a result of human activities. And we know that it's a reactant in the atmosphere where it acts as an aerosol. It decreases air quality, and clinging to the water droplets through the hydrological cycle, it eventually results in the formation of nitric acid, and nitric acid is another form of acid rain. So from sulfur you get the sulfuric acid based acid rains, and from this you get these mild forms of nitric acid as acid rain. And ammonia, atmospheric ammonia and nitric acid also damage the respiratory systems. So therefore, increased availability of inorganic nitrogen in aquatic ecosystems, including water, has another effect. It has an effect of acidifying the water, which kills fish, which kills other marine animals, and also it results in eutrophication of freshwater and saltwater systems. Eutrophication is a process by which a lake gets deprived of its biological demand for oxygen by the living beings, and slowly results in the death of all living organisms within the lake, and so the lake dies in some sense, and that's known as eutrophication of freshwater and saltwater systems, because it's toxic to the animals, including human beings, and does not allow them to breathe normally. So that in short is the lecture on how human activity impinges on the hydrological cycle, the carbon cycle, the sulfur cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. So all of them result in climatic change, global warming, depletion of the ozone layer, all things which you're familiar with, but now you understand how and why this has happened. Thank you.